Hey guys, if you've ever wondered what childhood felt like in the Victorian era, it was mostly a long, slow experiment in building character through mild suffering, with adults quietly insisting this was good for you. In this sleepy corner of history, everything moved at a pace that would make modern parenting blogs shut down out of confusion. The day usually began before sunrise because apparently the sun had no business deciding when children should wake up. A parent could simply open a drafty window and let the cold morning air do the job. It was considered refreshing, but mostly it just encouraged children to rethink consciousness altogether. Breakfast was rarely comforting. You might get porridge that tasted like lukewarm responsibility, served with the expectation that you'd finish it quietly because noise suggested you weren't grateful enough. Victorian adults believed silence built inner strength. In reality, it just taught kids to chew slowly and question everything. Chores were constant. Window cleaning, fire tending, floor scrubbing, tasks that today would require safety gear, back support, and at least 3 signed waivers. Back then, if you were small enough to crawl under furniture, congratulations, that was your job. Parents called it developing discipline, though it mostly developed dust allergies. Outside the house, life didn't get any easier. Schools looked like places designed by people who didn't like joy very much. The classrooms were cold, the desks were wooden, and the teachers had a kind of unwavering calm that comes from knowing no one can question you. Lessons were repetitive, not because repetition worked, but because it kept everyone conveniently tired. Victorian discipline operated on a sliding scale that ranged from stern talking to all the way to methods that would require immediate legal intervention today. Adults insisted it built moral fiber. Children quietly disagreed, but didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Even playtime, if it existed, looked suspiciously like unpaid labor. Some kids were expected to help in family shops, carry materials, mind younger siblings, or fetch water from distances that would qualify as light cardio today. If you were lucky enough to have toys, they were either wooden, breakable, or somehow both, and losing one usually resulted in a lecture about responsibility. Bedtime routines were not routines at all, but rather vague suggestions. Bedrooms were cold, blankets were thin, and warmth was considered something you earned by good behavior rather than a basic human need. Some households believed in keeping the windows open at night for airing, a concept that mostly ensured children woke up with stiff necks and philosophical questions about why windows existed. Privacy didn't exist either. Kids shared beds, rooms, and occasionally the same sense of existential confusion. Parents believed this built closeness, though mostly it built interrupted sleep. Victorian adults genuinely thought they were preparing children for the harshness of the world, which might be the only part they got right. Childhood was less a phase of life and more a slow apprenticeship in staying quiet, enduring drafts, and mastering the art of standing still. In the end, Victorian parenting wasn't cruel by intention, just shaped by a time when discomfort was ordinary and softness was suspicious. It's a sleepy slice of history that reminds us how far we've drifted from those cold bedrooms, those endless chores, and those very serious bowls of porridge. Even if the past still whispers its dry little lessons when the night gets quiet. Sometimes, the most striking part of Victorian childhood was how ordinary all this felt to the people living it. Parents weren't setting out to create future memoir material. They were simply following the customs handed down from their own drafty, uncomfortable childhoods. Comfort, in their worldview, was something that could make you weak, so they rationed it like an expensive spice. A soft bed was suspicious, warmth was indulgent, and if a child ever said they were tired, the standard response was that tiredness built character, which is a very efficient way to end all further discussion. Even affection operated on a strange schedule. Hugs were rare, praise was rationed, and most emotional guidance came in the form of phrases like, "You'll understand when you're older," which is something no child has ever found soothing. Meals followed similar logic. Lunch could be a repetitive combination of bread, something boiled, and the feeling that you should be grateful it wasn't worse. If you were from a wealthier household, the food might be nicer, but the expectations were stricter. Sitting perfectly straight was not optional. Slouching could trigger a whole lecture about moral decay. Imagine being 10 years old and discovering that the angle of your spine was apparently a sign of your future integrity. This was normal. The Victorian era had a deep commitment to turning tiny daily moments into quiet lessons about duty. Even a dropped spoon could become a miniature moral crisis. Outside, the world didn't offer much softness either. Streets were busy, smoky, and occasionally chaotic, giving children the feeling that the environment itself was judging them. If you wandered off, someone would definitely notice, but not always to help. And if your boots were uncomfortable, you simply accepted that this was what boots felt like. Victorian fashion wasn't designed with children in mind. It was designed with the idea of presenting a tiny, well-behaved adult. Running, laughing, or showing any sign of exuberance was considered undignified, especially in public, where adults preferred children to appear calm, tidy, and several decades older than they really were. Home life could feel like a long series of quiet rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't question instructions. Don't fidget. Don't look too excited. Parents believed these were essential teachings, like planting seeds of restraint. Children, on the other hand, spent a great deal of time contemplating walls, floors, and ceilings because there wasn't much else to do. And when the day finally slowed down, evenings were dim, lit by candles or lamps that flickered just enough to make everything feel more serious than it needed to. It was a setting that practically encouraged early bedtime, even if sleep came slowly in the cold. Still, underneath all the rigid structure, there was a strange sense of normality. Victorian childhood wasn't all gloom. It was simply shaped by the expectations of a time when comfort was scarce and survival felt closer to the surface. People did their best with what they had, even if that meant strict routines, stern lessons, and blankets that never quite reached your toes. Looking back, it becomes clear why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. Not because they were monsters, but because their version of tough love was, by modern standards, just tough. And in this slow, quiet retelling, the past drifts by like a cold draft from an open window, reminding us how history can feel both distant and strangely familiar. And yet, for all its strictness, Victorian parenting carried a kind of unspoken expectation that children should simply adapt. If a living room was cold, you added another layer. If chores grew heavier, you bent a little deeper. If school demanded memorizing endless facts, you quietly tried to remember them, even though half of them would drift away like chimney smoke. Adults assumed children were infinitely flexible, capable of absorbing discomfort the way sponges absorb water. It wasn't malicious, just a quiet confidence that young people could adjust to anything, which is a comforting belief if you're the one giving instructions, and slightly less comforting if you're the one receiving them. Play, when it finally arrived, was understated. Children made games out of ordinary objects because toys were luxuries and free time was a rare event. A stick could become anything. A ball made from scraps of fabric could offer a few minutes of escape. But even fun carried boundaries that felt heavier than they should. Running too fast risked dirtying your clothes. Laughing too loudly drew the attention of adults who preferred serenity. And the idea of indoor playtime was limited to activities that made almost no noise at all, which is a very short list. Many children spent more time listening than doing, waiting for a moment when no one needed them to be quiet, helpful, or invisible. Evenings brought their own rituals that delivered a sense of order without much warmth. Lamps were turned low to save fuel, which meant the house was filled with soft, sleepy shadows that made all movements feel slower. Parents spoke in low voices. Children responded with even lower ones. If a fire was lit, it became the unofficial gathering point. Not because it was cozy, but because it was the only place that didn't feel like stepping into a mild winter. And as the night crept in, parents often reviewed the day's behavior, not with praise, but with notes about how things could improve tomorrow. These improvements ranged from better posture to more enthusiasm for arithmetic, because Victorian adulthood had a remarkable ability to turn every detail into an opportunity for moral instruction. Bedtime, once again, was an experience more than a routine. Children climbed into cold sheets that took several minutes to stop feeling like refrigerated cloth. If you shared a bed, you tried not to elbow the other person, though you usually failed at least once. The windows might be left slightly open for fresh air, which meant you fell asleep listening to distant street sounds mixed with a steady stream of cold air testing your willpower. And in the rare quiet moments before sleep fully arrived, a child sometimes wondered whether all adults lived this way when they were young, and whether every generation simply accepted the same rules without asking why. In the larger picture, Victorian parenting wasn't about creating joy. It was about creating order in a world that constantly felt bigger, harsher, and more unpredictable than the four walls of home. Parents leaned on discipline because it was what they knew, and children grew into adults who repeated these patterns because it felt normal. From our modern, warmer, more cushioned perspective, it's obvious why so many Victorian parenting practices would be illegal today. They blurred the line between guidance and hardship. But in this slow, sleepy revisit, we can see them as they were: quiet, rigid, imperfect, and shaped by a world where comfort was a luxury and childhood was more of a training period than a sanctuary. And still, the most quietly striking part of Victorian childhood was how little anyone questioned it. A child could spend an entire morning polishing something that would be dirty again by sundown, and no one saw this as strange. Adults believed routine prevented chaos, and chaos, at least in their imagination, was always nearby, waiting to slip through the cracks of an unpolished brass handle. So children became tiny guardians of order, tidying, straightening, and maintaining the illusion that the household was sturdier than it felt. Even the simple act of standing still became a measure of character. If you could remain motionless for long periods without sighing, shifting, or showing signs of boredom, adults took it as evidence that you were growing into a respectable human being. Social rules had their own sleepy gravity. Visiting relatives meant sitting quietly on stiff chairs while adults exchanged long, drifting conversations about weather patterns, moral lessons, or distant cousins you've never met. Children weren't expected to participate. They were expected not to ruin the mood. You might be offered a biscuit, though only after demonstrating an appropriate level of meekness. And if you accidentally dropped crumbs, the silent disappointment in the room could swallow you whole. These moments taught Victorian children the art of being present without existing too loudly, a skill that came in handy for most of their young lives. Religion wove itself into daily routines, not through excitement or fanfare, but through quiet obligation. Sundays were a day of enforced stillness, a kind of weekly meditation in which children tried very hard not to think about how uncomfortable the church benches were. Sermons were long, and children sat through them with the steady resignation of small people who knew escape was impossible. The messages were moral, serious, and often wrapped in enough cautionary imagery to make even adults a little anxious. And yet, when the service ended, there was a peculiar sense of relief, as though everyone had collectively held their breath and could finally exhale. Seasonal changes didn't offer much variation in comfort. Winter meant layering clothes until movement felt optional, while summer introduced a slow humidity that made every task heavier. Spring and autumn passed by in muted transitions, noticeable only because the chores changed slightly. Victorian childhood wasn't measured in milestones, but in recurring tasks: polishing lamps, sweeping floors, mending small things, learning to read by dim light, and practicing handwriting that looked more like an endurance test than a creative act. Through it all, children observed their parents with a mixture of respect and quiet confusion. Adults rarely explained why things were the way they were. Rules simply existed, like gravity, and resisting them made life more difficult than accepting them. Children learned early that questioning anything, whether a chore, a rule, or a moral lesson, usually invited more work, not clarity. So instead of protesting, they adapted, internalizing the rhythm of days that felt both predictable and strangely heavy. Even leisure for adults didn't resemble anything comforting. Parents read serious books, embroidered serious cloth, or discussed serious matters. Joy was subtle, almost hidden, as though visible enjoyment might attract bad luck. In that environment, children grew up absorbing a quiet philosophy. Life is manageable if you do not ask too much of it. And perhaps that was the heart of Victorian parenting, a sincere, if slightly gloomy, attempt to shape children into people who could survive a world that didn't promise softness. Looking back from the warm glow of modern comforts, the distance feels enormous. Today, childhood is padded with safety, explanation, and at least some degree of emotional softness. Victorian childhood, by contrast, was more like a long apprenticeship in restraint. It wasn't intentionally cruel. It was simply built on the belief that difficulty shaped stronger adults. But in this sleepy retelling, where history drifts like a soft, persistent draft under a door, it's easy to see why these methods wouldn't pass even the gentlest legal review today. Victorian parenting did many things, quietly, sternly, consistently, but legality in the modern world is not one of them. And yet, even with all that heaviness, Victorian childhood moved with a kind of slow inevitability. Days blurred not because they were peaceful, but because they were patterned so tightly that any deviation felt suspicious. A child might wake, work, study, sit, eat, and sleep without ever encountering a moment that felt entirely their own. Freedom was something you pieced together quietly. Those few seconds between chores, the soft pause before a teacher called your name, the minute you spent staring out a window imagining something warmer, brighter, or just slightly less supervised. These tiny pockets of mental escape were often the closest thing to rest a Victorian child experienced. Households functioned like small machines, and children were expected to be reliable parts of that machinery. If something broke, a broom handle, a button, a sense of order, the child nearest to the problem was often considered responsible, regardless of logic. Adults weren't cruel about it. They simply assumed that responsibility built strength, even when the task was impossible. If you failed, it was chalked up to experience. If you succeeded, it was chalked up to expectation. Either way, the day marched on. Parental affection, when it appeared, was understated to the point of subtlety. A hand on a shoulder, a nod, a quiet, "well done," murmured in a tone that sounded suspiciously like a warning. These small gestures were treasured precisely because they were rare. Victorian parents believed too much warmth could soften the character, a phrase that sounds comforting until you realize they meant it in the same way one might talk about spoiled milk. Love was present, but it was folded neatly beneath layers of duty, propriety, and the ever-present concern that ease might make life harder later. Schools amplified this philosophy. Lessons were delivered with a seriousness that suggested a single mispronounced word could destabilize society. There was no room for creativity. Handwriting exercises alone could last long enough to make you forget what your own name looked like. And if you ever dared to ask why something mattered, teachers would respond with the classic Victorian explanation: because it builds discipline. The logic looped endlessly. Everything built discipline. Discipline built character. Character built a better future. And the future, apparently, required infinite preparedness, just in case it turned out to be even colder than the present. Still, there were moments, brief, fragile flashes, when childhood peeked through the cracks. A shared joke whispered behind a door, a half-smile from a sibling as you both endured the same strange ritual of daily expectations. The warmth of a kitchen on baking days, when the oven temporarily forgot the Victorian rule against making anyone too comfortable. These were the memories that softened the era in hindsight, even if they felt fleeting at the time. Nighttime wrapped everything in a deeper stillness. The house settled into soft creaks, the fire dimmed, and voices lowered to a hush. Victorian nights were quiet in that heavy, contemplative way that made children think too early about things far beyond their years. They lay under thin blankets, feeling the cold press around them, listening to the slow breathing of siblings nearby. Sleep didn't come quickly. It arrived like a slow surrender, a drifting acceptance that tomorrow would unfold in almost the same pattern as today. And that was the strange truth of Victorian parenting. It was shaped less by intention and more by inertia. Generations repeated the same customs because they had inherited a world where survival depended on endurance, not comfort. To them, toughness wasn't a trait, it was an insurance policy. Hardship wasn't the exception, it was the expectation. And so childhood became a quiet rehearsal for the adult world, long before anyone had the chance to decide what kind of adult they wanted to be. From our modern vantage point, with our warmth, our safety guidelines, our belief that children should be gently guided rather than stoically tested, those practices feel alien and illegal and slightly unbelievable. But in this soft retelling, with its slow, drowsy edges, the past becomes less a harsh judgment and more a dimly lit room we can peer into. A place where children grew up quickly, parents tried their tired best, and quiet endurance shaped an era that now feels far too cold to revisit, except in these sleepy little stories. And eventually, as the years drifted by in that steady Victorian rhythm, children grew into something the era considered proper, calm, restrained, quietly aware of their place in the world. Not because they chose this shape, but because the environment sculpted them slowly, day after day, like water wearing down a stone. By the time they reached adolescence, many carried themselves with a seriousness that looked almost theatrical to modern eyes. Their voices were measured, their movements were deliberate, their emotions were tucked away neatly, like linens folded for a guest who never arrived. What's strange is how little room there was for softness. Modern childhood makes space for curiosity, for loudness, for exploration, for mistakes that don't immediately carry moral consequences. But Victorian childhood was more like walking through a narrow hallway lined with quiet expectations. Every step had a purpose, every action had a lesson woven into it. Even kindness was framed as duty. Helping a neighbor wasn't encouraged because it felt good, it was encouraged because it demonstrated correct moral behavior. Joy was allowed, but it was expected to be tidy and brief, leaving no disruptive traces. Work, too, shaped the rhythm of life. If your family was poor, you might start helping in factories or workshops at an age when modern kids are just figuring out how homework works. For wealthier families, work took the form of endless education. Pages to copy, languages to memorize, music to practice until your fingers turned stiff. No matter your class, the message was the same. Idleness was suspicious. A quiet moment with nothing required of you felt almost illicit, like borrowing time from a future that didn't belong to you yet. Holidays offered some relief, though even that came with structure. Christmas, for example, wasn't the glowing, abundance-filled celebration we imagine today. It was modest, restrained, and guided by the idea that virtue mattered more than pleasure. A single small gift could be the highlight of a season. New Year traditions focused on reflection, not revelry. And birthdays, those modern celebrations of individuality, were often simple acknowledgments rather than events. In this world, growing up meant mastering the subtle art of internal discipline. Victorian children learned to quiet their impulses not because they were inherently obedient, but because their surroundings made rebellion feel like trying to run through molasses. Life discouraged sudden movements. It encouraged steadiness. The era had a way of smoothing out the rough edges of youth, leaving behind a kind of uniform seriousness that adults mistook for maturity. Yet beneath that surface, children remained children. They laughed when adults weren't listening. They whispered secrets under blankets. They envied the freedom of birds and stray cats. They dreamed about distant worlds where comfort didn't need to be earned. But they carried these inner landscapes quietly, like contraband emotions hidden beneath their daily duties. Those small rebellions, those tiny, flickering moments of selfhood, were often the only indicators that childhood still lived within them. As they stepped into adulthood, many Victorian children continued the cycle, not out of malice, but because they believed this was the only way to prepare the next generation for a world they assumed would always be unforgiving. It wasn't until much later, when society softened its approach to childhood, that people began to look back and realize how heavy those expectations truly were. In this slow, drowsy retelling, the truth becomes gently clear. Victorian parenting wasn't intentionally harsh, but it was undeniably rigid. It was built for a world that demanded survival over comfort, obedience over expression, endurance over ease. Today, those practices would cross legal lines faster than a cold draft through an unsealed window. But inside this quiet story, where memories float like dust motes in lamplight, we see them for what they were, a product of their time, neither romantic nor monstrous, just profoundly, sleepily human. And as that era finally eased into the 20th century, Victorian children, now adults themselves, carried the imprint of those early years like a faint watermark. Even when the world around them began shifting toward new ideas, softer philosophies, and warmer homes, there was still a quiet hesitation in them, a lingering instinct to brace for discomfort before it arrived. They had been raised in a culture where resilience wasn't just admired, it was assumed. Hardship wasn't discussed, it was absorbed, carried silently, and passed on without fanfare, like a family heirloom no one asked for. The irony is that many of these adults later looked back on their childhoods with a kind of subdued nostalgia, not necessarily for the cold bedrooms or strict routines, but for the sense of structure that made the world feel predictable even when it wasn't particularly kind. They remembered the sound of boots on wooden floors, the faint flicker of lamplight during evening chores, the quiet pride of completing a task without being told twice. These memories aged into something softer, even if the lived experience had been anything but. But a new generation was rising, one that questioned things. Why must children be silent at dinner? Why must warmth be rationed? Why must discipline always be the default answer? Slowly, gently, the idea of childhood began to shift. Children were no longer viewed as small adults in training. They were seen as individuals with emotions, needs, and inner worlds worth acknowledging. It was a quiet revolution, but a profound one. Laws began to change. Schools softened their approach. Homes grew warmer, both literally and emotionally. The old routines, once so rigid, began to feel outdated, like furniture that had sat too long in the same corner. Victorian parenting, once the unquestioned norm, became something people examined with a blend of curiosity and disbelief. The harshness that once seemed essential now looked excessive. The cold baths, the silent meals, the endless chores, they became artifacts of a world that had drifted far behind. Many adults who lived through it spoke cautiously about those years, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet understanding that they had endured something that had shaped them deeply, for better or worse. And yet, if you listen closely to the stories, you can hear the remnants of that era still echoing gently. A certain seriousness in the way someone folds laundry, a tendency to keep problems quiet, a preference for routines that feel almost ceremonial. These are the faint fingerprints of Victorian upbringing. Subtle, persistent, lingering. Looking back from the comfort of the modern world, with its central heating, child psychology, and bedtime routines that actually involve warmth, it's easy to see why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. It asked too much of children, offered too little softness, and disguised emotional neglect as discipline. But understanding it through the sleepy lens of history reveals something more nuanced. It was a system born from fear and hope in equal measure. Fear of a world that punished weakness, hope that strictness would forge better lives. And so the story settles here, in this dim and gentle closing moment. Victorian childhood drifts into the distance, a shadowed landscape of cold mornings, quiet rules, and small resilience. Not a place anyone would choose to return to, but a place that shaped generations, one quiet, disciplined day at a time. And so, as we reach the final quiet stretch of this slow Victorian drift, the picture becomes fully clear. Not dramatic, not shocking, just steadily, sleepily revealing itself, the way lamplight reveals dust floating in a still room. Victorian childhood wasn't one single experience. It was a layered collection of expectations, habits, and unspoken assumptions that wrapped around children like an extra, slightly uncomfortable coat. It wasn't about cruelty, though cruelty certainly existed in some homes. It wasn't about tenderness either, though moments of gentleness flickered here and there like brief warm spots on an otherwise cold floor. It was simply the way things were, repeated until no one questioned them anymore. In many households, a child could go full days without hearing a sentence meant purely to comfort them. Words were practical, instructional, or corrective. Silence carried its own meaning, and children grew skilled at interpreting it, whether a pause meant they had done something wrong or whether it simply meant the adult was tired from the weight of their own routines. Even love was quiet, folded into acts like mending a torn sleeve or placing an extra crust of bread on a plate. Victorian affection rarely announced itself. It had to be read between the lines. The strange thing is how normalized hardship becomes when it's shared by everyone around you. If every child you know wakes in a cold room, tends to endless chores, and sits through strict lessons, you stop thinking of it as hardship at all. It becomes a backdrop, like weather. And because adults treated it as necessary, children learned to tuck away their discomfort, to endure first and question never. Entire generations grew up with an internal script that whispered, "The world is difficult, and so you must be too." And yet, there were always cracks, small human interruptions that let a little warmth in. A mother humming while hanging laundry, a father quietly fixing a toy even though he pretended not to believe in frivolities. A teacher who offered a rare encouraging word, a sibling who shared a secret piece of fruit. These small gestures didn't negate the weight of the era, but they softened it just enough for memories to settle in with a tone less severe than the reality once felt. As reforms gradually spread, child labor laws, compulsory education, new ideas about psychology, the Victorian understanding of childhood began loosening its grip. It didn't vanish overnight, habits never do. They linger, fade slowly, echo themselves through generations. But eventually, the belief that children needed more guidance, more warmth, more protection began taking root. The old norms receded into history, leaving behind a record that feels impossibly stark to the modern mind. Today, we look back with a mixture of disbelief and sleepy fascination. The cold rooms, the silence, the discipline, the legal systems of the present would intervene long before a Victorian day was allowed to finish. But understanding that world doesn't require judgment so much as gentle observation. People lived within the limits they knew, trying to prepare their children for a life they assumed would demand toughness at every turn. And that's why, in this soft retelling, Victorian parenting becomes less of a scandal and more of a whisper from a world long past. A world that taught resilience at the expense of comfort, obedience at the expense of expression, quietness at the expense of childhood itself. It's a heavy lesson wrapped in a faint, drifting calm. As the last traces of that era settle into silence, you can almost hear what those children might have wished for: a little warmth, a little softness, a little permission to simply be young. And perhaps that is the final, gentle truth this sleepy history leaves behind. An understanding of how far we've come and how different the night feels when someone finally remembers to close the window. Even as the Victorian era faded further into memory, its quiet imprint lingered in unexpected corners of later generations. You can see it in the way some families still insisted on tidiness above comfort, or how certain grandparents preferred calm rooms, predictable routines, and children who spoke softly, as though echoes of a stricter age continued to hum faintly beneath the surface. Old habits, when wrapped in nostalgia, often survive long after their original purpose dissolves. And that's exactly what happened with the remnants of Victorian parenting. They drifted forward not as rules, but as instincts. Those who grew up under that system rarely talked about it in detail, not because they wished to hide anything, but because it felt unnecessary, like describing the temperature of the air or the color of the walls. Hardship that is universally shared becomes invisible. Many carried a strange mix of pride and resignation. Pride in having endured it, resignation in having had no choice. They didn't see themselves as victims of a strict age, just participants in a long, quiet tradition of doing the difficult thing because it was what life required. But memory softens the edges. As people aged, they recalled not just the cold rooms, but the small comforts that slipped through the cracks. The way soup tasted on winter evenings, the warmth of a crowded kitchen, the gentle hush of a candle being blown out. These small images clung to them like stray threads from a worn blanket. And in retelling their stories, slowly, calmly, without drama, they allowed younger generations to understand without inheriting the weight of the experience. Modern perspectives make the past look harsher than it felt at the time. Laws today protect children from work, from silence, from expectations that stretch far beyond their years. Emotional warmth is not a luxury, it is a standard. Homes are heated not just by radiators, but by the belief that childhood should be soft enough to grow without fear. Yet despite this, there is still something quietly fascinating about the Victorian world, a place where ordinary people did their best with limited understanding, shaping futures they could not imagine. Looking back through this sleepy retelling, the era becomes less intimidating and more like a dim corridor we've walked through and emerged from. Its lessons remain, not to be repeated, but to remind us how fragile comfort is, how hard-won softness can be, and how easily a society can forget to make space for the very people it hopes to raise well. And so the story settles again into silence. Victorian parenting slips further into the past, a distant echo behind the warm, modern hum of a world that finally learned to treat children as children. A reminder that history doesn't just teach us what once happened, it teaches us what we should never drift back toward, even in the quietest moments. And in that gentle fading, something else becomes clear. Victorian childhood didn't simply disappear, it dissolved slowly, leaving faint outlines in the habits and manners that lingered long after. Even generations later, you could still catch a glimpse of its shadow in small gestures. The way someone folds a shirt with unnecessary precision, or apologizes too quickly for taking up space, or stiffens slightly when a room falls silent. These weren't rules anymore, just leftover echoes drifting quietly through family lines. People who grew up under those echoes often couldn't explain why certain things felt proper, why sitting up straight made them more comfortable than slouching, why they preferred calm over excitement, why a tidy room felt less like a preference and more like a requirement. They didn't think of these as lessons. They simply absorbed them, the way their ancestors absorbed cold mornings and stern glances without questioning. Victorian restraint had become diluted, softened, and reinterpreted, but it hadn't vanished entirely. Even the language carried faint traces. Old sayings like, "children should be seen and not heard," survived long enough to be repeated ironically. Phrases about discipline, self-control, and moral fiber drifted into modern speech like old furniture no one bothered to move. None of it had the weight it once carried, but the outlines remained, faint, dusty, harmless only because the world around them had changed. And maybe that's the quietest lesson the Victorian era left behind. The idea that norms can feel eternal while they're happening, only to unravel quietly once society shifts. What once felt like the natural order of things, the cold baths, the long silences, the rigid expectations, eventually became stories, and then curiosities, and finally textbook entries that make readers pause and wonder how anyone thought that was normal. But the people living it didn't think in those terms. They weren't characters in a cautionary tale. They were just families, surviving in a drafty world, doing what they thought would give their children the best chance in a life where comfort was scarce, work was constant, and uncertainty hovered just outside the window. They loved quietly, worried quietly, and raised children quietly, because loudness felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. And now, centuries later, we approach their world like stepping into a dim attic, carefully, slowly, brushing aside the dust to understand the people who came before us. Not to judge them, but to understand them, to see how far we've come, to recognize that softness, warmth, and emotional safety are privileges that had to be discovered, not inherited. By the time the last remnants of Victorian parenting were finally replaced by modern ideas of childhood, the transition felt almost dreamlike, one era exhaling, another inhaling. And what remains now is simply the outline of a life once lived, quiet, rigid, earnest, and impossibly far from anything that would be allowed today. A distant hum from a colder world, drifting softly into the warm quiet of ours. And as the story drifts even further into its final stretches, you begin to see how Victorian childhood became less a period in history and more a kind of mood, an atmosphere that clung to generations long after the era itself dissolved. Not harsh, not dramatic, just quietly persistent. The kind of feeling you only notice when comparing it to a world where warmth is ordinary and comfort is expected, not rationed. For many families, the shift didn't happen in a single moment. It was more like watching thawed frost melting slowly along the edges of a window pane, one small change at a time. Children being encouraged to speak a little more, adults offering explanations instead of commands, a blanket added to a bed because a child looked cold rather than because they had earned it. These adjustments were small, almost invisible, yet each one chipped away at the old Victorian frame. What truly marked the transition, though, was the emergence of a new idea, one that would have baffled many Victorian parents, the belief that children needed emotional warmth as much as physical care, that feelings mattered, that childhood wasn't merely a training ground for adulthood, but a stage of life deserving gentleness. The concept sounded ridiculously modern compared to the strictness that shaped previous generations, but once it took root, it spread quietly and quickly. Still, echoes of the past lingered in subtle ways. A parent who insisted their child be strong without explaining what strength meant. A family that treated struggle as a necessary lesson rather than something to ease. A lingering discomfort with showing too much softness, as though affection needed to be wrapped carefully to avoid spoiling anyone. Victorian habits didn't vanish. They got quieter, lighter, thinner, like shadows cast by furniture that had long been moved. If anything, the most enduring Victorian inheritance was the sense of order, an instinctive preference for routines, for predictability, for the calm hum of things staying just as they should. You can still see it today in people who find peace in tidiness, who straighten objects without thinking, who breathe easier when the world around them follows a pattern. It isn't discipline anymore. It's simply the ghost of an old survival strategy that once kept families steady in a far harsher world. And yet, beneath those traces, modern childhood stands in sharp contrast, a landscape filled with color, softness, and choices that Victorian children could only have imagined. Warm bedrooms, play as a right, not a borrowed moment, education designed for curiosity, not obedience, guidance instead of correction, a world where a child's voice isn't an interruption, but a contribution. The difference is so wide that they almost feel like separate species. Which is why, when viewed from the present, Victorian parenting feels not only outdated, but almost unreal. Something that shouldn't have existed, though it clearly did, quietly, firmly, and consistently. And in a strange way, that's what makes it so fascinating. It reminds us that what feels normal today would once have been unimaginable, and what felt normal then now borders on impossible. Through this sleepy retelling, you can almost picture those children sitting beside their parents, stiff wool collars scratching their necks, hands folded neatly, eyes cast downward. Not out of fear, but out of expectation. They weren't mistreated by the standards of their time. They were simply shaped by a world that valued endurance more than comfort. And as their story continues to soften across centuries, it becomes a reminder of how fluid childhood is, how societies redefine it again and again, stretching or shrinking it depending on what they believe the world requires. Victorian parenting was built for survival. Modern parenting is built for flourishing. Somewhere in between lies a quiet trail of lessons, half forgotten but still gently present. So the tale drifts now, like dust settling in a long-abandoned room, leaving us with the lingering understanding that childhood, no matter the century, always reflects the world that shapes it. And in the slow warmth of the present, Victorian childhood finally lies down to rest, wrapped not in a thin blanket, but in the soft knowledge that the world grew kinder after it. And as the memory of that era stretches thinner, it becomes easier to see how Victorian childhood wasn't just a product of its time. It was a response to a world that felt endlessly uncertain. Parents weren't strict because they enjoyed strictness. They were strict because uncertainty frightened them more than their children ever could. Hardship had shaped their own early years so thoroughly that they mistook endurance for virtue and silence for strength. Those patterns, once established, were difficult to unlearn. And so children inherited not only their parents' rules, but the quiet anxieties that lived beneath them. In many ways, the home functioned like a small fortress against the unpredictability outside. Streets were rowdy, illnesses spread without warning, work was unstable, and news traveled slowly enough that people learned to assume the worst. Inside the home, tight routines created a sense of control, even if that control came at the expense of comfort. Chores kept hands busy, rules kept minds focused. Order prevented the fear that chaos might creep in through a crack in the wall. And while modern eyes might see these habits as harsh, to Victorian families, they were simply a way to hold the world at bay. Still, children often sensed the underlying tension. They watched their parents navigate long workdays, worries unspoken, hopes tucked into quiet corners of the house like forgotten objects. And even though children did not understand the details, they absorbed the tone, the seriousness, the restraint, the careful balance between need and duty. Victorian children learned early that life demanded steadiness, and that softness, while not forbidden, was something to be rationed, like every other precious thing. As decades drifted on, these patterns slowly softened. Industrial life changed, medicine advanced, education reformed. Societies reshaped themselves with new laws, new technologies, new philosophies. The world became marginally safer, and with safety came the radical idea that children might not need to be hardened quite so early. The definition of childhood expanded, slowly at first, then more quickly, as people began to imagine futures where children could explore, express, and even rest without fear of becoming unprepared adults. But Victorian roots didn't vanish completely. Even now, in quiet moments, traces emerge. The instinct to finish tasks perfectly, the feeling of guilt when resting, the urge to keep emotions neatly folded rather than spilling into the room. These aren't burdens, they are faint echoes, softened across generations, drifting like a memory that no longer belongs to anyone in particular. They remind us of a time when life required a kind of quiet fortitude, not because people wanted it, but because they didn't know any other way. And perhaps that is why Victorian parenting still fascinates. It represents a world both distant and strangely familiar. A world where people tried their best with limited tools, limited comforts, and limited understanding. A world where love was often disguised as discipline, and discipline was mistaken for necessity. A world that shaped millions of childhoods with its cold rooms, stern routines, and soft, unspoken hopes that the children would grow up strong enough to survive a life harder than anyone wanted to admit. In the soft hum of this retelling, the era loses its severity and becomes something quieter, an old photograph held at arm's length, its edges faded, its subjects stiff but earnest. You can almost sense the weight they carried, not because they were cruel, but because they were burdened by a world that demanded seriousness from every corner. And now, when we compare that landscape to our own, warm bedrooms, softened voices, structured guidance, emotional vocabulary, it becomes apparent why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. Not because their intentions were wrong, but because the world has changed enough to reveal the cost of those methods. The thin blankets, the heavy rules, the quiet expectations, they all belong to a time when survival overshadowed tenderness. As this story settles into its final, quiet stretch, Victorian childhood feels less like a strict chapter and more like a cautionary whisper, a reminder of what happens when a society forgets to make room for childhood itself. In the warm drift of the present, with its gentler rhythms and softer nights, that whisper fades slowly, like the last curl of smoke rising from a lamp that's finally been extinguished. A small fragment of history now settling into rest, calm, distant, and peacefully asleep. And as the last remnants of that era dissolve into the wider quiet of history, what remains is an almost tender awareness of how universal the desire to protect children has always been, even when the methods were shaped more by fear and hardship than by understanding. Victorian parents looked out at a world full of uncertainty, illness, unstable work, and unpredictable weather, and concluded that strength was the single most valuable skill a child could carry. And so they tried to build strength the only way they knew how, through structure, restraint, and persistence. But strength, as they understood it, came wrapped in discomfort. Cold rooms, long silences, expectations that outpaced the children who carried them. And while modern perspectives can't help but recoil at these conditions, Victorian families rarely saw them as cruel. They saw them as necessary, the thin line between order and vulnerability. Every daily ritual, every stern reminder, every quiet rebuke was a small attempt to prepare children for a world that didn't often give second chances. Yet children, in their small, resilient way, found life within those boundaries. Even when the rules pressed in from every side, small joys managed to slip through. A shared glance with a sibling across a dinner table too quiet for their liking. The rare warmth of sunlight catching the dust in a room that was usually dim. The sound of rain on windows that didn't quite seal, turning discomfort into something almost soothing. It was in these tiny observations that Victorian childhood remembered itself, not as a season of happiness, but as a season of slow, steady endurance, softened only by the smallest fragments of comfort. When these children grew older, they carried these fragments with them. Some clung to the discipline, believing it had served them well. Others quietly loosened the grip, sensing that life didn't need to be quite so rigid anymore. And then a generation arrived that looked backward with a level of curiosity and skepticism that Victorian parents could never have imagined. Reformers, doctors, psychologists, educators, they reshaped the definition of childhood piece by piece, replacing strictness with structure, silence with conversation, obedience with guidance. And slowly, the landscape changed. A warm bed became a right, not a privilege. A child's voice became something to be heard, not minimized. Emotional safety became as important as physical well-being. Even toys transformed, from rare objects with moral lessons attached to simple sources of joy that required no justification. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear the faintest breath of Victorian influence in the modern world. It appears in the instinct to clean up before guests arrive, even if no one expects it. In the internal whisper that says rest should be earned, not taken freely. In the subtle way people straighten their posture when things feel uncertain, as if bracing themselves against invisible expectations. These small habits aren't burdens. They're leftovers, softened through generations, echoes that no longer carry weight, but still linger like faint outlines on old wallpaper. As the modern world keeps drifting toward greater comfort, greater emotional openness, greater protection for childhood, the old Victorian patterns feel almost unreal. But it's their very contrast that makes them quietly compelling. They remind us that childhood is not a fixed concept. It's a mirror that reflects the priorities of its time. When life was unpredictable, childhood became preparation. When life became safer, childhood became exploration. And when society learned to understand emotions, childhood finally became a space where softness wasn't considered a weakness, but a foundation. And so, Victorian parenting, viewed through the slow haze of this sleepy retelling, becomes a reminder of the distance we've traveled, how far the idea of childhood has stretched, softened, warmed. It asks nothing from us now except reflection, no judgment, no condemnation, just a quiet acknowledgement that people do their best with what they know, and that sometimes the world has to change before families can change with it. As the story settles into its final calm, Victorian childhood lies far behind us, dim, orderly, wrapped in wool that was never quite warm enough. A place we visit only through memory and history, and always from a safe distance. And like a draft that finally stops slipping through the cracks, it fades into stillness, leaving the modern night warm, softened, and grateful for every comfort the past never had. And as we drift deeper into the quiet afterglow of that long-gone world, the Victorian era begins to feel less like a chapter of history and more like a distant landscape seen through a fogged window, close enough to examine but too far to step into. What stands out isn't any single rule or harsh detail, but the overall atmosphere. A world where life moved heavily, where expectations were stitched tightly into every day, and where childhood felt more like preparation than experience. For Victorian families, the rhythm of life rarely allowed the luxury of questioning. Survival required focus, predictability, and a kind of emotional minimalism that modern people might mistake for coldness. But to them, it was simply practicality. Love didn't vanish. It just hid behind tasks, behind the breakfast prepared before dawn, behind the mended sleeves, behind the long hours a parent spent working so the household didn't collapse. It was a quiet love, one that spoke in duties rather than warmth, because warmth was too scarce to spend freely. And yet, for all its restraint, the era wasn't entirely without tenderness. It was simply a tenderness expressed in strange, muted ways. A parent placing a cloak around a child before sending them into the cold. A teacher offering a rare nod of approval that carried more weight than modern applause. A mother saving the softest heel of a loaf for the youngest child. These gestures were faint, but they were real. Small pockets of humanity tucked into a world that often felt too serious for its own good. As society changed and new ideals slowly replaced old ones, these quiet gestures were among the first things to survive the shift. Rules dissolved, expectations loosened, but the instinct to care, carefully, quietly, consistently, remained. It just found new forms. Bedtime stories instead of stern lectures, warmth instead of endurance, conversation instead of silence. Childhood expanded from something thin and strict into something broader, gentler, and oddly luminous. By the time Victorian methods became relics rather than norms, people carried a mixture of emotions about them. Some spoke of those years with a surprising calm, as if hardship were simply part of life's natural landscape. Others felt the weight of what they had missed, warmth, comfort, recognition, and vowed not to pass the same patterns along. And many stood somewhere in between, neither condemning nor praising the past, simply acknowledging that it was built from a different understanding of what the world required. From our modern viewpoint, wrapped in comforts that would have seemed unimaginable then, Victorian parenting appears unbearably stark. Laws today would intervene swiftly in situations that were once considered ordinary. But within its own context, the era wasn't shaped by neglect so much as necessity. Hardship was common, loss was familiar, security was fragile. And in a world like that, preparing children for difficulty felt like an act of responsibility, even if it came at the cost of softness. Looking back now, through this long, steady, drowsy retelling, Victorian childhood becomes almost peaceful in its distance. No longer a burden, no longer a threat, just an echo of a world that tried, in its own imperfect way, to create order in a life that rarely offered any. Its lessons, though outdated, remind us how profoundly society can evolve when it finally has room to breathe. And so the story rests here, in this final, quiet glow, where the past lies folded neatly like an old wool garment, scratchy, heavy, and no longer needed, but kept as a reminder of how far warmth has traveled. A small relic of a colder world, gently settling into silence. And as the echoes of that old era continue to soften, the Victorian world becomes almost dreamlike, dense with routines, dimly lit, structured in ways that feel foreign now, yet strangely human when viewed through the sleepy lens of distance. What lingers most is not the severity, but the quietness, a kind of stillness woven through daily life that modern people rarely experience except in brief pauses. Children grew up inside that stillness, learning to interpret silence as communication. A parent's pause carried meaning. A teacher's controlled expression delivered entire lessons without needing words. Even the house seemed to have moods, creaking softly in cold mornings, settling into muffled quiet at dusk. In that environment, children developed an early awareness of the subtle emotional undercurrents around them. They learned restraint not because anyone explained it, but because the entire world around them modeled it, hour after hour. The strange thing about looking back is how easy it becomes to sense the humanity beneath the rigidity. Victorians were not unkind. They were simply shaped by an unforgiving reality. Illness, poverty, industrial hazards, and social pressures loomed constantly, making survival feel like an everyday performance. Children were prepared for this not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that softness diminished resilience. In a world where fate could turn harsh without warning, resilience was one of the few defenses families felt they could cultivate. Yet despite these intentions, childhood often folded itself into narrow shapes, obedient, quiet, alert. A Victorian child knew the weight of responsibility long before understanding the world that required it. They learned to move carefully, to worry early, to shoulder expectations they rarely questioned. And beneath all that, they carried their own small hopes, quiet ones, half-whispered in the dark, tucked beneath thin blankets that never quite held the warmth. As the decades drifted onward and society evolved, these early habits didn't disappear entirely. They softened and stretched. Parents, relieved by new stability and safer conditions, slowly allowed children more room to breathe. Schools became less about memorization and more about exploration. Home life welcomed warmth without fearing it would weaken character. The world shifted from preparing children for hardship to preparing them for possibility, and childhood expanded accordingly, wider, gentler, quieter in a different way. But even now, faint traces of Victorian upbringing remain scattered through modern life. A lingering discomfort with idleness, a feeling that tasks should be completed before rest can be enjoyed, an instinct to keep emotions orderly, as though untidiness were a moral failing. These remnants are not burdens, just small reminders of an older rhythm that once shaped entire generations. Understanding this doesn't redeem the era, nor does it condemn it. Instead, it reveals a simple truth. People live within the limits of their time. They hand down what they know. They raise children with tools they believe will help them survive. And sometimes, without meaning to, they pass along the shadows of their own fears. In the warmth of the present, it's easy to see how Victorian parenting would be illegal today. Too strict, too cold, too restrained for a world that now recognizes the weight childhood carries into adulthood. But in this long, drowsy retelling, the era becomes more than a list of outdated rules. It becomes a reminder of how far society can travel when it learns to value childhood not as preparation, but as life itself. And so the story dims once more, settling into the same quiet it has carried from the beginning, steady, subdued, drifting into softness. Victorian childhood recedes like a distant lantern seen through fog, no longer guiding anyone, no longer required, but still glowing faintly with the memory of a world where people did their best in a time that asked too much. A faint, sleepy echo from a colder age, now finally allowed to rest. And as the last layers of that world settle into memory, Victorian childhood becomes something almost weightless, an old pattern traced faintly across generations, visible only when the light hits it at a certain angle. The sharp edges have dissolved. The stern voices have faded. The cold floors no longer sting. What remains is more of a mood than a history, a faint texture of restraint woven into stories told long after the era itself dissolved. In many families, the remnants survive through habits rather than rules, a tendency to lower one's voice in serious moments, the instinct to prioritize order over comfort, a quiet belief that too much ease might somehow invite misfortune. These were not conscious choices. They were inherited atmospheres, carried gently through time from people who once lived with far fewer certainties than we do now. Yet when you imagine a Victorian child moving through that world, you can almost sense the emotional architecture they lived inside. Instructions delivered in calm, measured tones. Days organized around necessity rather than preference. A steady undercurrent of caution that shaped everything from how they played to how they thought. Their imagination existed, but it was often tucked safely beneath layers of expectation, emerging only in private moments when the house exhaled into its evening quiet. The emotional distance often attributed to the era wasn't coldness so much as compression. Feelings were folded neatly, like linens kept for guests who rarely arrived. Adults didn't dismiss emotion, they simply had no template for expressing it. And children learned to navigate around this absence in ways that made sense to them, seeking comfort from siblings, from small rituals, from the predictable sounds of daily life. A kettle rattling over low heat, the muffled thud of boots by the door, the soft crackle of a fire whose warmth never extended quite far enough. By the time the world shifted into a new century, children who had grown up in that environment carried with them a peculiar combination of resilience and restraint. They approached adulthood with steady hands and guarded hearts, shaped by a childhood that taught them to endure quietly, to observe carefully, to rarely assume anything was guaranteed. And though they often softened these habits when raising their own children, the traces lingered, faint, persistent, almost imperceptible. Modern life, with its warmth, its vocabulary for feelings, its belief that childhood should be expansive rather than compressed, stands in gentle opposition to the Victorian world. Today, we treat softness as a virtue, not a liability. We encourage curiosity rather than quietly managing it. We give children space not because it is convenient, but because we understand the weight of early experiences. And in that contrast, Victorian parenting appears as something almost museum-like, a relic from a colder, narrower landscape. But even as we judge the era from afar, there is a quiet understanding that people then were not doing less. They were simply working with less. Less knowledge, less stability, less margin for error. Their choices were shaped by the terrain beneath their feet, a terrain far rougher than the one we stand on now. In that sense, their sternness becomes less an accusation and more a historical reflection, a way of surviving a world that felt unpredictable and unforgiving. And so, Victorian childhood becomes a long exhale, one that begins in a cold room with thin blankets and ends here, in a warm present that barely resembles the world that shaped it. The transformation feels almost like waking from a long sleep to discover the room has changed around you. The air warmer, the walls softer, the silence more gentle. In this final drift of the story, all that remains is the faint outline of a time when childhood was tight and narrow, and adulthood arrived early, often without announcement. That outline no longer instructs us, it merely reminds us. A distant sketch of a world that taught strength at the cost of softness, discipline at the cost of expression, survival at the cost of ease. Now it simply fades, quietly, evenly, leaving behind a soft understanding of how far we've traveled and how warmly the present wraps around a childhood that no longer needs to brace itself against the cold. And as the perspective widens one last time, the Victorian world begins to resemble not just a distant era, but a kind of emotional climate. an atmosphere that wrapped itself around families in ways they didn't fully perceive. Childhood, in that climate, wasn't defined by innocence or discovery. It was defined by adaptation. Children learned early how to fit themselves into narrow expectations, the same way people learned to fit themselves into tight rooms, carefully, quietly, without drawing too much attention to their discomfort. Looking back now, it's easy to imagine Victorian childhood as rigid, but within that rigidity lived a steady rhythm that many children found oddly reassuring. Consistency, even when uncomfortable, offered a kind of stability. The same chores, the same routines, the same quiet pauses before adults spoke. A child growing up in such a world could predict almost everything, not because life was gentle, but because it was meticulously patterned. And in that predictability, they found the closest thing to comfort the era could offer. But predictability isn't the same as softness, and Victorian childhood rarely provided the latter. Children were expected to understand their responsibilities sooner than they understood themselves. Feelings were treated as inconveniences, distractions from duty. If a child cried, adults might wait silently for the emotion to subside, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine belief that acknowledging the feeling would make it harder to overcome. In their eyes, resilience meant leaving emotions unwatered, letting them dry out before they grew unruly. It's strange, then, how deeply many of these children craved the very things their environment couldn't easily provide: warmth, reassurance, gentle explanation. They found these small comforts in scattered places: the softness of a pet's fur, the rare smile from an older sibling, the slow hush of church bells marking the end of a long week. These tiny, fleeting moments often became the brightest memories of adulthood, glowing faintly within the harsher shadows of their upbringing. As time moved on and reforms reshaped the world, the contrast became impossible to ignore. New ideas about childhood spread quietly but steadily, like warm air seeping into a cold house. Scholars and doctors began arguing that comfort wasn't indulgent but essential. Emotional development wasn't a distraction, it was part of the architecture of a healthy life. Slowly, homes began to adjust, schools softened, expectations loosened. It wasn't a revolution, just a gradual exhalation after decades of holding one's breath. Victorian parents, had they lived to see it, might have looked upon these changes with equal parts confusion and relief. Confusion, because their understanding of childhood was so tightly woven into survival that alternatives felt impractical. Relief, because deep down, many of them must have known how heavy the old ways were, even if they couldn't articulate it. People often keep doing what they know, not because it is best, but because it is familiar. And that is perhaps the most quietly human truth this era offers. People rarely recognize the weight of their habits until the world grows light enough to put them down. Only when warmth becomes ordinary do you realize how cold the past was. Only when children's voices become welcome do you recognize how much silence once filled a home. Only when comfort becomes expected do you appreciate how revolutionary it is to be gentle. In the soft, sleepy glow of modern life, Victorian parenting feels impossibly distant, like touching a piece of old iron left too long in the cold. But through this slow retelling, it becomes more than a list of bygone rules. It becomes a reminder of a humanity that persisted even when it didn't know how to express itself. A world trying to prepare its children as best it could, despite having so few tools to work with. And as the story settles now, quiet even, fading gently like lamplight at the end of a long night, it leaves behind not judgment, but understanding. Victorian childhood becomes a faint echo from a world that asked too much, offered too little, and never realized how long its patterns would linger. A cold era, finally warmed by distance. A strict childhood, finally softened by time. A whisper of the past, now drifting into rest. And as the story drifts further into its final, softened edges, the Victorian world becomes something almost quiet enough to forget, yet too formative to fully disappear. Childhood, then, wasn't just a stage of life. It was a slow apprenticeship in being useful, being orderly, being composed. Children learned not by exploration, but by imitation, mirroring the steady seriousness of the adults who stood just out of reach, carrying their own unspoken weight through each long day. For many Victorian children, The world felt enormous but strangely narrow. Streets were busy, factories loud, illnesses unpredictable, and opportunities for imagination tucked into whatever quiet moments they could steal. But the home, structured, restrained, predictable, felt like a small enclosure designed to keep chaos at bay. Adults believed the walls guarded the children. In truth, the walls guarded the adults from the fear of losing control. Still, even within those tight boundaries, children found ways to experience small, private versions of freedom. A few minutes staring at the sky before chores began, a whispered joke with a sibling behind a half-open door, the satisfying rhythm of tapping a stick along a stone path when no one was watching closely. Childhood expressed itself not in bursts but in crumbs, scattered, fragile, easily brushed away by the next command or expectation. And yet those crumbs stayed with them. Years later, grown into adults shaped by strictness but softened by memory, they held on to those tiny pieces of joy as proof that childhood had not been entirely swallowed by duty. They remembered the smell of soap-damp linens drying near the fire, the glow of lamplight turning dust into floating gold, the rare kindness of a teacher whose voice dipped from sternness into something gentler. These memories didn't undo the hardness of the era, but they wrapped around it like thin cloth around a rough object, softening the outline even if the shape remained. As the modern world continued to expand in warmth and understanding, these early fragments of childhood began to take on new meaning. People started recognizing how deeply children are shaped by the environments they grow in, not just physically, but emotionally. The past, once accepted without question, began to look less like a series of traditions and more like a series of constraints. Restrictions that had made sense in a colder, harsher world now appeared unnecessary, even harmful. And slowly, the idea of childhood transformed from something functional into something valued. Victorian parenting, once considered practical and even virtuous, gradually faded into a cautionary example, a quiet reminder that children are not simply future adults to be fortified, but present humans to be understood. And as societies reshaped their expectations, the distance between past and present grew so wide that the old ways became unrecognizable, almost surreal. Laws changed, homes changed, voices softened. Childhood, once compressed, blossomed outward. Yet even now, if you listen in the right silence, you can detect faint traces of that older world. The instinct to tidy a room before allowing yourself to rest. The habit of hiding discomfort behind calmness. The subtle feeling that productivity is somehow a moral requirement. These aren't burdens, they're small shadows cast by a long-ago era, harmless in their softened form, but still present enough to remind us where we came from. And in recognizing them, the modern world quietly closes the chapter. Victorian childhood settles fully into history, no longer shaping us, merely brushing lightly against our awareness, an echo in a warm room, faint and distant. The era that once defined childhood now becomes nothing more than a dim illustration of what it meant to grow up in a colder world, where love and worry wore the same expression, and strength was taught one quiet, measured day at a time. And as the story drifts gently to its resting place, the past feels smaller, softer, and finally at peace, like a long winter evening that has, at last, given way to morning light. And as the telling drifts onward, the outlines of Victorian childhood grow softer still, like chalk sketches left out in a slow drizzle. The details remain visible, but the harshness fades into something quieter, gentler, more contemplative. It becomes easier to see their world not as a list of outdated rules, but as a landscape shaped by the anxieties and limitations of its time. Rigid, yes, but also deeply human in its attempts to make sense of uncertainty. Victorian parents lived in a world that required steadiness. There were no safety nets, no assurances, no guiding frameworks that explained child development or emotional needs. Everything they knew came from repetition, habits passed down like heirlooms, often without questioning. And so they raised their children the way they had been raised, expecting endurance, praising quiet obedience, assuming stoicism was the only shield against life's unpredictability. They weren't indifferent, They were simply cautious in all the ways a difficult world had taught them to be. Children, in response, learned to become fluent in subtleties. They learned the meaning of a pause in conversation, the significance of a glance, the quiet shift in an adult's expression that signaled whether the evening would remain calm or become tense. These unspoken cues became their emotional roadmap, teaching them how to move carefully, speak sparingly, and exist in the narrow spaces adults left open. Modern eyes might see this as emotional suppression, but to them, it was simply how one navigated the world. Yet even within these tightened boundaries, small moments of softness persisted. Unplanned, unannounced, almost accidental. A parent lingering a second longer than necessary when tucking a child's blanket. A rare laugh breaking through a household's usual restraint. The faint warmth of a fire shared during cold evenings when everyone drew closer without comment. These were the quiet comforts that Victorian children often remembered most vividly, not because they were frequent, but because they were rare enough to glow in memory. As society evolved, these fleeting pockets of tenderness became the seeds of something larger. New ideas about childhood, ideas emphasizing play, growth, curiosity, began to spread slowly through schools, books, and reform movements. The rigidity of the era did not vanish overnight, but it softened along the edges, the way winter eventually yields to early spring. Parents began to see children less as miniature adults needing discipline, and more as individuals requiring understanding. Even the smallest shifts, allowing more conversation at dinner, offering explanations instead of commands, signaled a quiet revolution. By the early decades of the 20th century, the transformation was unmistakable. Childhood had expanded, voices grew louder, affection became more visible. Warmth was no longer rationed, it became an expectation. Victorian norms retreated into the shadows of memory, preserved mostly through stories, old photographs, and the occasional habit someone forgot to shed. What once felt like the only possible way to raise a child became a historical curiosity, something studied rather than lived. And still, the remnants linger in subtle ways. You can see them in the instinct to hide discomfort behind composure, in the quiet guilt some people feel when resting instead of working, in the preference for order even when disorder poses no real threat. These traces are faint, softened beyond recognition, but they are reminders of the long, steady chain of habits linking the present to a colder past. They carry no weight now, they simply exist, like faint impressions left by an earlier generation's footsteps. From the warmth of the modern world, with its safety guidelines, emotional vocabulary, heated rooms, and bedtime routines built around comfort, Victorian parenting appears impossibly strict. But understanding it through this slow, sleepy retelling reveals the gentler truth hidden beneath the stern exterior. People were doing the best they could in a time that demanded more from them than it offered in return. Their methods were shaped by fear, hope, and limited knowledge, not malice. And so, Victorian childhood settles, finally, into its rightful place, not as a model to imitate, nor a tragedy to mourn, but as a quiet chapter in the long story of how societies learn to care for their young. A chapter that reminds us that softness is not weakness, warmth is not indulgence, and childhood grows best when the world around it makes room for gentleness. As the story comes to rest, the old era lies far behind, still, faint, almost like an echo disappearing into the folds of a long, drowsy night. And as the narrative slides even further into its quiet conclusion, the Victorian world begins to feel almost symbolic, less a collection of strict routines and more a portrait of how people respond when life gives them no guarantees. Childhood in that era took the shape of the world around it, narrow, disciplined, cautious. Not because anyone believed children needed hardship, but because hardship was already woven into daily life, and children simply grew into its pattern. Homes, then, were often places of muted determination. Adults carried themselves with a contained seriousness, as though every gesture needed to conserve energy for whatever unexpected challenge might arrive next. Children observed this atmosphere long before they could understand it, absorbing the tone like background hum. The emotional vocabulary of the age was thin, feelings rarely translated into words. Instead, they settled into the spaces between tasks, occupying the air quietly, like dust in lamplight. And yet, even in that scarcity, there were traces of tenderness, subtle, easily overlooked, but unmistakable. A parent smoothing a child's hair without acknowledging the gesture. A sibling sharing a worn toy even though they barely had it long enough. A neighbor offering a warm roll from the bakery because they knew the family had struggled that week. These small acts were the closest thing to brightness many children experienced, and they learned to treasure them with a level of seriousness only Victorian children could manage. Over time, these small moments became proof that affection persisted even in strict environments. The structure of Victorian parenting didn't eliminate love, it simply concealed it beneath layers of practicality. In a world where comfort was rare, affection became quiet. In a world where survival demanded stability, emotional expression became careful. People weren't withholding care, they were rationing it in the same way they rationed everything else. As reforms swept through society and new ideas reshaped the understanding of childhood, those quiet, rationed forms of care were finally allowed to expand. What had once been the norm began to look outdated, and what once seemed practical began to feel unnecessary. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. Rooms warmed, voices softened, expectations loosened. Children were encouraged not just to endure, but to grow. Not just to follow, but to wonder. And with each passing generation, Victorian parenting drifted further into the background. It became something grandparents reminisced about with half smiles, aware of its hardness, yet oddly affectionate toward the memory of it. It became something historians described carefully, noting both its restrictions and its context. It became a reference point, a mirror showing how dramatically the world had changed. What's left of it now lives only in the faintest habits. The instinct to finish a task fully before resting. The subtle guilt that appears when one feels unproductive. The quiet, composed tone many people still adopt when delivering difficult news. None of these are burdens. They are softened shadows, barely visible unless you look for them. They no longer shape childhood. They simply remind us of a time when life demanded more stoicism than softness. And, as we step back to see the entire journey, from cold rooms to warm ones, from silence to conversation, from obedience to emotional understanding, it becomes clear why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. But through this gentle, sleepy retelling, the era becomes something more than a cautionary tale. It becomes a small, distant fragment of human resilience, imperfect, restrained, and shaped by the belief that survival required stillness. Now, finally, the story lies in a warm present that would have seemed almost fantastical to those families. A world where childhood is protected, where emotions matter, where comfort is recognized as a foundation rather than a luxury. A world softened not by chance, but by the hard lessons of eras like the one we've been quietly walking through. And so, Victorian childhood, with all its rigidity and restraint, folds itself neatly back into history. Like a wool garment worn thin by time, no longer useful, but still carrying the faint scent of a world that once leaned heavily on endurance. A world that now feels distant enough to examine gently and soft enough to let go. And as the tale drifts forward one more time, the Victorian world settles into something almost fragile. Less like a rigid structure, and more like a faded memory that remains only because it shaped so many early lives. Looking at it from the soft comfort of the present, it becomes clear how much of that era's approach to childhood was born not from intention, but from limitation. People could only give what they understood, and the understanding of the age was narrow, practical, and deeply cautious. In that environment, children learned to read the world by observing the adults who carried the weight of it. They grew familiar with the small signs of fatigue, a mother's quiet sigh, a father's slow untangling of his boots after a long day, the stillness in a room when money was short or illness nearby. These were lessons learned without being taught, absorbed silently because silence was the prevailing language of home. And within that silence, Victorian children developed an early sense of responsibility. They stepped carefully, spoke sparingly, avoided drawing attention unless absolutely necessary. Adults didn't demand perfection, but the atmosphere implied it all the same. A clean floor meant a calmer evening. A well-behaved child meant one less thing to worry about. Good posture, tidy clothes, and obedient manners weren't just rules. They were small contributions children made to a household always on the brink of exhaustion. Yet even in this restrained world, warmth flickered in its own muted tones. A parent might leave an extra piece of bread on a child's plate without comment. A grandmother might tell a brief, understated story after supper. A father might repair a broken toy at night after insisting he didn't have time that afternoon. These gestures carried quiet weight because they were rarely surrounded by sentimental words. A child recognized love not by how it was spoken, but by how it was slipped gently into the day. As time went on, the accumulation of these gestures, small, steady sparks of care in a rigid environment, revealed the truth that the Victorian world rarely admitted. Even strict structures cannot fully suppress tenderness. It finds its way through the cracks, softening edges one moment at a time. When the world eventually began to change, embracing gentler views of childhood, these hidden sparks became the foundation for something broader. The era that came next didn't reject Victorian parenting entirely. It simply loosened its grip, allowing light to enter where darkness had crowded. Emotional understanding grew, education expanded, homes warmed with new comforts, and childhood, once compressed, began to breathe. What remains today of the Victorian way is faint, barely a whisper, a tendency toward politeness, a certain reserve in difficult moments, the instinct to be strong even when strength isn't required. These remnants linger like the faint scent of old wood in a renovated room, noticeable only when the modern world becomes very quiet. But the strictness itself, the cold mornings, the heavy expectations, the thin blankets, the stillness mistaken for discipline, that part has finally dissolved. Laws prevented its return. Knowledge replaced its assumptions. And society learned, slowly and deliberately, that children flourish under warmth, not austerity. In the gentle drift of this telling, Victorian childhood becomes not a warning, but a reminder that care evolves, that understanding deepens, that the world grows kinder when it has the chance. People then did what they believed was necessary. People now do what they understand is better. And between those two truths lies the long, unfolding history of childhood itself. As the final traces of the story ease into rest, the past settles like dust in a quiet attic, present but no longer heavy. A distant world exhaling at last, leaving behind only the soft knowledge that even the strictest eras are ultimately softened by time, memory, and the warmth that comes after.